Okay, just before the Rabbi begins his SHIUR, all of the SHIURim this morning are dedicated to Chayal Maoz Morel Zichrono Levracha, blessed memory. He was injured a couple of weeks ago, last week, quite seriously down in Gaza, and yesterday he unfortunately succumbed to his wounds. So any Torah learned this morning will be Le'ilui Nishmato. They were no more sorrow.
Amen. Okay, good morning everyone. I hope you're well. Again, just to remind people, because I go off on many digressions, but there is indeed a main topic, and the main topic is discussing the mitzvahs in the Torah that are connected to Yetzias Mitzrayim. That's our topic. And in that connection, we were discussing the mitzvah of remembering the Exodus every single day, Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, and then we in turn went into the interesting question whether that mitzvah will apply when Mashiach comes. Because remember, Ben Zoma takes the position, based on the verse in Yirmiyahu, that the Messianic redemption is going to be so much greater in scope that we're not going to even mention the Exodus, and therefore that is a mitzvah that's going to drop out. And our discussion, I don't want to repeat the whole discussion, was, is that not a violation of the Rambam's principle that the Torah is immutable, the Torah is unchangeable, and the Rambam says explicitly that every single mitzvah will apply when Mashiach comes, including Korbanos, including the Yomim Tovim. I'll get to your Purim question. And how could Yetzias Mitzrayim be an exception to that? So you recall, this is Rav Yosef Albo's question. Rav Yosef Albo's question on the Rambam is, how could he say that the mitzvahs are eternal and they'll never drop out? According to Ben Zoma, there is one mitzvah that does drop out, and that is the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. Was Ben Zoma an apikoros? Was Ben Zoma a kofar in one of the 13 Ikrei Amunah? Number one, that's not very logical. And number two, the Rambam rules like Ben Zoma, because the Rambam paskins, we mentioned the Exodus at night, and therefore, remember, if Kol Yemei Chayecha is marbe the night, you're not marbe limota Mashiach. So the Rambam himself paskins it's going to drop out. So that's Rav Yosef Albo's question. You will remember that I shared with you the answer of the Rashba that says that since the essence of remembering the Exodus is to thank Hashem for Geula, so in a sense, if I'm still thanking Hashem for a greater redemption, the spirit and purpose of the mitzvah has not been nullified. The mitzvah continues, but it simply connects to a different historical event. Okay. Now, the last thing we talked about was a sugya in Maseches. Oh yeah, let me address your question. The question was raised that bottom line is, putting aside Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, the bottom line is the Rambam says explicitly that all of the mitzvahs are going to apply limota Mashiach, and he mentions specifically Korbanos and Chagim, all the Yomim Tovim. So people ask a question, is there not a famous Maimer Chazal that says that Liasid Lavo, all of the Yomim Tovim are going to be nullified except for Purim? There are actually two girsos. One girsa says except for Purim, and another girsa says except for Chanukah and Purim. There are actually two texts. But that implies, if I read it literally, there's not going to be Pesach, there's not going to be Rosh Hashanah. Okay, Shabbos there'll be, because Shabbos is technically not a holiday. But no Rosh Hashanah, no Yom Kippur, no Sukkot, no Pesach. Right? So how do you reconcile that? I mean, again, the Rambam's principle is Torah doesn't change. And the Rambam says explicitly, Limota Mashiach, you're going to keep all the mitzvot. What about the Maimer Chazal, that all the Moadim are going to be batal? And indeed, let me point out, the Rambam himself in Hilchos Megillah brings that very Maimer Chazal. So you can't even give an answer that the Rambam didn't paskin like that Maimer Chazal, because the Rambam in fact does paskin like that Maimer Chazal. So how do you reconcile it? So it is a very good question. The simplest answer is that the word batel, a holiday will be batel, does not have to mean it will be discontinued. it means it will pale into relative insignificance as compared to Purim. Meaning to say, Purim will be the most important of the Chagim because it shows HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hashgacha even in times of darkness, even in times of concealment. So Batel does not mean operationally you're not going to keep the holiday, but it means Purim will have a greater importance than even the other holidays. And remember, this is the remez of the Arizal, that even the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, is called Yom Kippurim, and the Arizal has a drasha. Yom Kippur is a day almost like Purim, almost like Purim. Of course, this year we have Purim a month later, but even in Adar Rishon, we celebrate to some degree the 14th and the 15th of Adar. We call it Purim Katan. And in Yerushalayim, we look for every excuse to have parties. So, so I'm sure there will be celebrations of Purim Katan as well, both on Yudalid and Tetzvav. And then, of course, we'll have the big Purim. And of course, it's amazing how what does it say? The more things change, the more they stay the same. So many years after Purim, we face threats of enemies that want to destroy us. And the source of that threat is from the Persian kingdom, which is presently known as Iran. So the Hamans of the world are, sadly, very much around. And when we think about Purim, we should think about the idea that just as Purim was the downfall of the Persian enemy that tried to destroy us, may this Purim also, and let it even be Purim Katan, let it be early, but L'chala Pachot Purim, let it be the downfall of the enemies of the Jews that try to destroy them. This is a great Zman. As I said last week, people ask, should we downplay or not celebrate as much on Purim? And again, I'm not posking here or anything, but it seems to me that the relevance of Purim is so powerful to the exact situation that we're in, that it's a holiday that we need to emphasize and not simply forget about or downplay in some way. Okay, so now I want to deal with another issue. You'll recall, we did discuss a sugya in Maseches Nida, which also goes to the immutability of the Torah, and that is the issue of, can you put a Shatnez on a met, right? We dress a Meis in what are called tachrichim. Tachrichim are burial shrouds. Now, this will not come up in modern life. And obviously, tachrichim are not made with Shatnez today. But, the Gemara often discusses hypothetical questions to illustrate principles, even though it's not going to come up, halacha l'maisa. And that is, the Gemara says, can you put tachrichim on a Meis that are Shatnez? Wool and linen. Right, I'm not allowed to wear wool and linen. A Jew cannot wear wool and linen. What about a dead Jew? Can a dead Jew wear wool and linen? So the Talmud basically says there's no problem, because once a person is dead, they're not obligated in mitzvahs. In fact, that's the meaning of the verse in Tehillim, Lo ha-mesim yahalaluka. The dead cannot praise God. Now, the truth is they do praise God in Gan Eden, but it means they can't praise God by doing the mitzvot. Once a person is dead, he is patur min ha-mitzvot. So there's no problem in putting Shatnez on a dead body, but the only problem, the Gemara says, is that if the mitzvot are going to apply after resurrection, so we don't know when that's going to be. Maybe that'll happen before the tachrichim have disintegrated. So at the moment of resurrection, he's chayav in the mitzvos again, and then you're going to have a problem. In other words, the only problem is not putting it on the dead body, but the problem of what will happen when there's resurrection. And the Gemara even says, and if there is an opinion that says after resurrection, the mitzvot will not apply. Remember, there is an opinion that says that. There's no problem at all. There's only going to be a problem if after the resurrection, the mitzvot will apply. This is the Gemara in Nida. Right, yeah. This was announced. Yeah, this is just announcing that this is Le'ili Nishmata Chayal, Ma'oz Ben Eitan and Verda Morel. Once again, we should think about his neshama and the family as we're learning. So The Gemara says there is no problem in putting it on a dead body. The only problem is, T'chiyat HaMeitim, he's going to be transgressing Shatnez then. So now, Tosos in Maseches Nida, and this is a total digression, but it's a fascinating Tosos. Tosos Maseches Nida asks a very good question. Many of you are probably familiar with the halacha that's in Maseches Brachos, that when you are within 4 amot of a Meis, a man is not supposed to have his tzitzis out. A man is not supposed to wear tefillin. One should not learn Torah. And the reason is, since the Meis is not able to do mitzvos, you are mocking him by doing mitzvos in front of him. And the Gemara quotes a pasuk in Mishlei that says, Loeg Larash, when you make fun of a poor person, right? You make fun of a poor person generally, like you show off your wealth in front of a poor person. Cheref Oseu, you are cursing his maker. You're shaming God, so to speak. So Loeg Larash, in its literal sense, refers to a person who's financially poor. Don't mock a poor person by showing off your wealth. But Chazal say that the inability to do mitzvahs is a great poverty. And the neshama hovers around its grave. And you come in, and you wear your tzitzis, you wear your tefillin, you do your learning, and this Meis is not able to do that. That is painful. That is humiliating to the neshama. And therefore, you are mechuyev to distance yourself from the Meis in order not to transgress the proverb of Shlomo called Loeg Larash. This is the Gemara in Brachos, and the Shulchan Aruch paskins this way. There is a whole machlokas. Well, what about davening? See, it's an interesting question. I mean, if you're telling me I don't do mitzvahs in front of a Meis, so if I'm at a kever, the kever of a parent, the kever of a tzaddik, whatever it is, does that mean I don't say Tehillim? Does that mean I can't daven mincha there? So some say that anything you're doing in honor of the Meis would be permitted, like saying Tehillim and the like. But if you just want to daven mincha, which is something you have to do anyway, you are indeed mechuyav to distance yourself. You don't daven mincha right next to a Meis. Okay. Now Tosos asked the following question: L'chayra, if I put Shatnez on a Meis, and I'm basically telling this dead guy, hey, you don't have mitzvahs anymore, so you can wear Shatnez. Oh my. Why isn't that a Loeg Larash? The same Loeg Larash that I don't wear tefillin in front of a dead body, because the neshama that hovers over the grave is going to be in pain. So if I put Shatnez on a Meis, and I'm telling the Meis essentially, don't worry about it, you don't have these mitzvahs anymore, isn't that Loeg Larash? In other words, why does the Gemara say that the only potential problem is he'll be resurrected with Shatnez? And if you hold the mitzvahs are not going to be reactivated, there is no problem. There is intrinsically a problem. I am doing an action that creates the implication that he doesn't have to keep mitzvahs anymore. And that the Gemara calls is Loeg Larash. And the Gemara totally ignores that concept in the context of the Shatnez. This is the kasha of Tosfos in Maseches Nida. So the Meshech Chochmah offers a very, very ingenious answer. He says you find that the Isur of Loeg Larash only applies to positive commandments, mitzvos aseh, like tefillin, like tzitzis, like Torah learning. It does not apply to a lo saseh, like Shatnez. Now, I'll explain why, but that's his chiluk. And therefore, you will never find Loeg Larash in the context of a mitzvah lo saseh. Now, why is that so? So here's what he says. He says, a mitzvah saseh, when you fulfill a mitzvah saseh, that adds holiness to your neshama. So I'm gonna use numbers. The numbers are meaningless, but they're just for examples. Let's assume you wake up in the morning and your kedusha quotient is a +5. Meaningless number. When you daven al natila shadayim, it goes up to 6, right? You daven shachris, tefillin, tzitzis, brachos, birkat hamazon. Every mitzvah you do is raising your level of holiness, right? Holy, holy, holy. A Meis is kind of stuck where he was when he died. Because since a Meis cannot do mitzvahs anymore, a Meis does not have the ability to increase his holiness quotient. Now, there are some ways that he could, by his children doing mitzvahs, etc., but the Meis himself does not have that ability. So as a result, when a Meis sees you adding to your Kedusha, and the Meis is unable to add to his Kedusha, the Meis is in great pain. The Meis is humiliated. The Meis feels tsar, and that is the yesod of Loeg Larash, because you're growing in your holiness, and the Meis is kind of limited, meaning even if he was a great tzaddik, as high as he is, let's say he's at 1,000,000, okay, but he can't become 1,000,001. He's 1,000,000, and that's tsar, because you're starting maybe at a lower level, but you're able to go up and up and up. That's what they say. The Vilna Gaon, who died, Chol HaMoed Sukkos, they say towards the end of his life, maybe the last day of his life, last minute of his life, we're not sure, he was crying and he was holding his tzitzis. And he said, there is nothing like this world. The tzitzis cost a few kopecks, a few pennies, whatever it was. And in this you can achieve and gain so much olam haba for almost nothing. But once you die, whatever you are is what you are. You're not going to go up. Now, a low sas has a different dynamic, the Meshech Chochmah says. Let me give you a simple example. The Aseret Dibros tell us, you're right, lo tirtzach, you're not allowed to murder. You're not allowed to commit adultery. Now, Baruch Hashem, I've gone through many, many days where I have not murdered somebody, and I have not committed adultery, right? And I hope that most of you, all of you, I'm sure, have similar experiences. Now, here's my question: if you started the day with a +5, and you successfully managed not to murder somebody, is your kedusha going to rise, or you're simply going to remain? Meaning the following: if you violate a negative commandment, you lose kedusha, but if you fulfill a negative commandment, that just maintains you at your status quo. Unlike positive commandments, which add to your holiness to God. I'll go back, I'll actually qualify this shortly, but this is the basic idea. So therefore the following: if a lo taseh does not increase your kedusha, but you lose your kedusha because you're rebelling against God, it turns out a Meis is not at any disadvantage in wearing Shatnez. Because let's assume, again, the numbers are meaningless. The Meis died at a level of 5. Now, and I'm 5. He's 5 and I'm 5. Now, if I put Shatnez on myself, since I'm rebelling against God, I go from 5 to 4. But if a Meis puts Shatnez on, since he's not rebelling against God, he remains at 5. So actually he's better off than me, because the negative commandment is not going to affect him, because it's not going to be pogem in his kedusha. So says the Meshech Chochmah, it's not shayach a Loeg Larash, because there's nothing for him to be unhappy about. When I'm doing tefillin and tzitzis and learning, the Meis is unhappy because I'm growing and he can't grow. But when I put Shatnez on him, he's not losing anything by the Shatnez, because the only thing not wearing Shatnez does to me is keep me at 5, and he'll be at a 5 even with the Shatnez. And therefore, says the Meshech Chochmah, there is no din of Loeg Larash on a mitzvah lo sasa. Yeah.
Why would anyone ever put Shatnez on a Jew?
No. Well, okay. I mentioned, I guess maybe you walked in a little late. I had mentioned that the Talmud often raises theoretical questions that are not lemaisa. Now, the truth of the matter is, the case would be somebody dies, and you literally have no other clothing to bury them in other than Shatnez. But the point is, I don't know if you heard the Gemara at all. I mean, the Gemara I mentioned is, once a person is dead, they don't have commandments.
Right, and that I understand.
So there's no prohibition.
But if Jews are buried in a talis, which is clearly not Shatnez,
yeah,
then why would somebody be concerned about what clothes you put on a dead body? Because you don't dress them in Judaism anyway. That's why this makes no sense.
Well, things don't make sense. You're right. If you have a Chevra Kadisha that is fully stocked, but remember, people can die in all sorts of circumstances. People can die on desert islands. People could die on treif ocean voyages. Meaning there are emergency situations where there may be no choice. Now, Baruch Hashem, these are going to be rare and far between. But as I say, the Talmud will often address very uncommon situations to illustrate certain points. So you can't really say, well, this will never happen. I agree with you. I actually agree with you. It probably will not happen. But the theoretical point is still there, that there is no prohibition in putting Shatnez on a Meis. And once again, people die, unfortunately, in all sorts of tragic. I mean, I don't want to connect it to Gaza or whatever it is, but you might have a situation. So somebody dies in captivity, and another Jew wants to try to bury them somehow, and you may be stuck with an extreme circumstance, and you need to know what the halacha is. Yeah.
Is there like what you're saying? Is there like a time limit? Because at a certain point, the neshama will leave the physical body. So.
Yeah, the neshama leaves the body right away, but the thing is, there's a certain hovering thing. Now, you do have a good point, which I don't have a full answer for, because there is a concept that the neshama hovers during Shiva, and then, to some degree, for 12 months. But after 12 months, it's not there anymore. So your question is a good question. So why can't I put on tefillin in front of a dead body that died more than a year ago, given the fact that the neshama is not there? So that's a good question. Apparently, even when the neshama is in Shemayim, it has an awareness of what you're doing in front of its physical body, and that gives us SHIUR. Okay, so I want to point out that the Mashech Chachma's idea that negative commandments don't add to your holiness, they simply prevent the depletion of your holiness, is not so clear. I mean, I gave you an example where I think it is clear. If I went through a day and I didn't murder and I didn't rape, so that probably does not make me a holier person. That just means I maintain my holiness and I don't lose it. On the other hand, if you consider mitzvot for which there's a very strong Yetzer Hara, mitzvah, because most people don't have a desire to murder somebody, or at least a desire that they'll carry out, meaning the fact that you didn't kill somebody today was probably not an exercise of conquering your Yetzer Hara. Sometimes it might be, but okay. But on the other hand, take something like Lashon Hara. Right? Lashon Hara is a big Aveira, and all of us, we have desires to do that. And if I conquer my Yetzer Hara, and I don't get angry or I don't speak Lashon Hara, I would think that is a spiritual accomplishment, meaning to say, I think that does add to your Kedusha. And in fact, there's a Chazal that says, if you sat and you didn't do an Aveira, if it's that type of Aveira, it's Ki'ilu, you did a mitzvah. So the statement that the fulfillment of negative commandments do not create holiness, they just prevent depletion of holiness, is undoubtedly true for those negative commandments which I am not struggling with. I think it would be a little less true with the negative commandments that we actually struggle with. But once again, it could be that Shatnez is something we don't have a big Yetzer Hara for, so therefore I don't get reward for not wearing Shatnez. I simply don't lose my Kedusha, and therefore the Meis is not affected. Now, I want to raise another issue, and you just raised about Talis, because I'm going to give you a case where this answer doesn't work very. I'm going to say before I get to that, let me mention that the Meshech Chochmah's Svara was actually echoed in a different context by the Maharal. Maharal, who lived much earlier. The Maharal lived in the 1500s, Maharal of Prague. And the Maharal deals with a perennial question that is discussed in many, many, many places, and that is the teaching of our Chachamim that the Avos kept all of the mitzvahs of the Torah even before Matan Torah. This is an old Masorah based on a Mishnah in Kedushin. The Avos, actually, the Mishnah does not say the Avos. The Mishnah says Avram Avinu kept the whole Torah before it was given. It seems to be understood, although it's a little bit of a jump, that this statement that Avram Avinu kept the whole Torah before it was given does not only apply to Avram, but it applies to Yitzchak and Yaakov, and it even applies to the Shvatim. Now, because of this, there's a huge literature of commentary in which different things the Avos did that seem to be in violation of the Torah. How do you justify it? Now, the simple answer would have been, hey, before the Torah was given, these laws didn't apply. That would be the simple answer. But if you go with the idea that they kept the Torah even before it was given, how do you explain this? So one of the questions, I'm not going to go over all the questions, this could literally be a course in and of itself, but one of the famous questions is Yaakov marrying Rachel and Leah, because Rachel and Leah are sisters. Now, under the Noahide law, under the law that applies to the non-Jews, there is no prohibition in marrying two sisters. So the issue of marrying two sisters is only after the Torah was given. But the problem is, if the Avos kept the whole Torah even before it was given, how could Yaakov marry two sisters? So the Maharal brings two interesting answers that he rejects till he gets to his third answer. The first answer Maharal brings is based on the Ramban. The Ramban gives the following idea, that the Avot kept the whole Torah before it was given only when they were living in Eretz Yisrael. Because of the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, they felt an obligation to keep the Torah even before Matan Torah. They knew it with Ruach HaKodesh and the like. Since Yaakov married Rachel and Leah when he was in Lavan's house, the Avos did not feel any obligation. See, this is interesting. The distinction the Ramban is making is not mitzvahs tluyas b'aretz. And I mean, there are certain mitzvahs that only apply in Eretz Yisrael. But the Ramban is suggesting that even a mitzvah like not marrying two sisters, that does apply in chutz la'aretz after Matan Torah. It is not connected to the land, but when the Avos were keeping the Torah on a voluntary basis, they would do so only when they are beheichal hamelach, when they are in the palace of the king, and therefore, in a sense, Rachel and Leah got grandfathered in, that since they were married in Chutz La'aretz, Yaakov could keep them, so to speak, when he came back to Eretz Yisrael, although the Ramban suggests perhaps this might be a reason that Rachel died shortly after they came, because once they're in Eretz Yisrael, Yaakov is governed by a higher standard. Now, this is the Ramban's Yesod, that only in Eretz Yisrael did the Avos keep the Torah. Maharal doesn't like that, because the Maharal says that's introducing a distinction that is foreign to the Torah itself, because the Torah says some mitzvahs only apply in the land of Israel, like Truma, Shemitah, and some mitzvahs apply universally, like not marrying two sisters. So, mimanavshach, if the Avos take the position that before Matan Torah we don't have to keep anything, then Yaakov could marry two sisters even in Eretz Yisrael. Elamai, he's going to keep the Torah. Well, if he's going to keep the Torah, he ought to keep the Torah the way the Torah gives it. And once the Torah is given, it doesn't differentiate between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. So why should the Avos make a differentiation that the Torah itself doesn't make? No. So again, the Ramban's answer would be that since pre-Matan Torah, the observance of the Torah was optional and not mandatory, so the Avos could choose. Okay, that's the Ramban, but the Maharal claims that's illogical, because you either keep the Torah or you don't keep the Torah. Either position would have been justified, but if you keep the Torah, you got to keep the Torah the way the Torah is given, and marrying two sisters is applicable in Chutz La'aretz. Yes?
Didn't the Ramban also say, though, that only performing a mitzvah in Eretz Yisrael is on a higher level than performing a chutzah?
That's correct. That is the Ramban Shita, and this could very well be the basis of his distinction, why the Avos felt it was more important in Eretz Yisrael. That could exactly be the case. Now, the Maharal then brings a second answer, which he doesn't source. He doesn't say who said it, but he seems to say it's somebody else. In other words, it's not his own answer. And that is, when Rachel and Leah joined Yaakov Avinu's family, they repudiated the idolatry and the paganism of Lavan. or Besuel and Lavan. Therefore, they underwent what would have been a pre-Matan Torah conversion. Now, it's hard to understand what conversion actually meant then, but the repudiation of idolatry had a halacha of conversion. So here's an amazing halacha. Some of you might know this, but it's kind of a mind-blowing halacha. There is a rule for conversion that a convert is a newly created entity. Ger shenitgayer kekatan sheno ladami. Newly created. That has some very surprising applications. Don't quote me on it, but this actually means if a brother and a sister convert to Judaism, they are no longer related to each other, and under Torah law, it's not genetically advised, but under Torah law, a brother can marry a sister, a mother can marry a son, a father could marry a daughter, because ger shenitgayer kikatan shener ladami. Now rest assured that the rabbis came in and they prohibited this rabbinically because of appearance's sake, but under Torah law, it's actually permitted. So says the Maral in the name of, he doesn't say who, but the Maral says that someone gave this answer. Since Rachel and Leah converted by adopting the monotheism of Yaakov, they are no longer related to each other. And therefore, these are two unrelated women that polygamy was permitted. And obviously, polygamy was permitted. That wasn't the problem. Right, so that's answer number 2, which Maral does not reject, but he prefers to give a third answer. And his third answer is very fascinating. That, and it's to me, it's the same svar as the Meshech Chochmah, and that is when we say the Avos kept the Torah before it was given, that only applies to the positive commandments, tefillin and the like, but they didn't observe necessarily the negative commandments, because once again, the positive commandments added to their holiness. The negatives don't add anything. It simply depletes. But if you don't have a commandment, you're not doing a sin, there's no depletion. Therefore, even in Eretz Yisrael, the Maral says, the Avos did not feel bound by lo sasas. This is mamash. In fact, it's a little surprising to me that the Meshech Chochmah does not quote the Maral, but it seems to me it's exactly the same svar. Let me give you another context where this comes up. You know the familiar principle that even if a person is not obligated in the commandment, if they do the commandment, they still get reward, but it's a lesser level of reward. This is called Gadol HaMitzuvah V'yosa Mimi She'eino Mitzuvah V'yosa, meaning the person who is commanded to do a mitzvah gets more reward than a person who does a commandment, does a mitzvah that they're not commanded. In fact, the Marshal says, this is the source of why we celebrate a bar mitzvah. Why is a bar mitzvah a happy event? I mean, you might say it ought to be maybe a little bit of trepidation. The answer is because until bar mitzvah or bas mitzvah, any mitzvah the boy or the girl did, they'll get reward for it, but as an eino mitzvah, they're not yet commanded. Once they become commanded, Baruch Hashem, now they do mitzvahs, they get the reward of a mitzvah b'yaisa. That is the makor of Sudas mitzvah, bar mitzvah. Again, maybe we'll discuss another time. Shouldn't that logic be 100% the same for a bas mitzvah? Meaning, if we were to ask, putting aside kolish, tznius, that's not an issue, but l'chayra, if there's an obligation to make a festive meal when my son becomes 13, and the reason is because we are rejoicing in the fact that he has transitioned from an eino mitzvah v'yaisa to a mitzvah v'yaisa, that is 100% identical to when my daughter becomes 12. She is also transitioning from an eino mitzvah v'yaisa to a mitzvah v'yaisa. So l'chayra, one would assume that the chiyuv of a sudas mitzvah for a bas mitzvah should be 100% the same. Now again, you may not make it the same way, you may not take the same form, that's a separate issue, but the notion of a special suda. Now, Rav Avadia Yosef so paskins, and his logic is extremely strong. He says there is no basis whatsoever to differentiate between a sudas mitzvah for a bar mitzvah boy and a sudas mitzvah for a bar mitzvah girl, etc., because the simcha is the same, going to from Eino mitzvah v'yaisa to mitzvah v'yaisa. Again, that is the simple svara. Rav Moshe, however, has a tshuva that I will admit is a little difficult to understand, in which he says, although it's certainly permitted and maybe encouraged to make a special seuda for a bas mitzvah, he does not classify it as a seudat mitzvah, because he says it is not of the same nature as the obligation of a bar mitzvah. But again, the svara is a little bit elusive. He seems to be using tznius as a reason, but it's hard to understand because making a Suda is not necessarily a contradiction to tznius. I mean, at most you might say, don't make it so public, even if you're going to go in that direction. But a Suda among the family, what's going to be, what's the issue of tznius? I mean, people are eating together anyway. So I'll leave that for maybe another occasion. But this is the principle. Now, Tosfos asks a very obvious question. Why do you tell me? Oh, yes. So I'm saying. So 1 second. So that means what? If a woman takes lulav, she's exempt, but she gets reward. Eino mitzvah v'yaisa. Sitting in the sukkah, she's exempt, but she gets reward. Eino mitzvah v'yaisa. Okay. So this is a well-known principle. It's that even if you're not obligated in the mitzvah, you do it as an eino mitzvah v'yaisa, and you get schar. As an aside, Tosfos asks the obvious question. Why should a mitzvah v'yaisa get more reward? I would think the opposite, like time and a half for overtime. If all I do is what I have to do, so that's one thing. But if I go beyond what I have to do, I ought to get extra credit. Meaning, you might argue that the 12-year-old who goes to Shachris deserves more credit than the 13-year-old who goes to Shachris. The 13-year-old has to do it. So what? Yashakoach, you're doing what you have to do. What do you want? The 12-year-old going beyond the law. A woman who takes lulav going beyond the law, right? It's the opposite. We would think if I do more than I have to do, I ought to get more credit. So Tosfos says, the beautiful psychological thought, that once a person has to do something, the Yetzer Hara is much stronger not to do it. Because I don't like to be told what to do. Yeah, I'll learn, I'll daven, I'll do everything, but don't tell me I have to do it. Once I have to do it, I want to rebel. Right? The husband, this is not autobiographical, who wants to take out the garbage to help his wife, and as he picks up the garbage, he hears his wife calling from the other room, be sure to take out the garbage. There will be a moment in which he says, I'm putting it down. No one tells me, nobody tells me what to do. Right? We have a rebellious streak. Now, this might be one of the explanations. There are many more explanations. Why a boy after bar mitzvah sometimes experiences a little bit of a decline. Meaning, look, I mean, there are a lot of reasons. I mean, there was a big event, but one part of it is psychologically is that he was doing mitzvahs as an 11-year-old, a 12-year-old, geschmack. He was doing more than he had to do. He had a sense of pride. Now he's like everybody else. He goes to show, no big deal. I mean, that's what you're supposed to do. I also say, I don't mean to be cynical, that, one of the things that's happened in the reform movement over the past 2 decades is a positive development in some ways. There's been a great increase in the mitzvah of tefillin. More and more Reform Jews in their temples are wearing tefillin, but the increase is almost 100% women. So the women are increasing their tefillin wearing, the men are not. Maybe Tosfos is an explanation. Women are exempt from tefillin because it's a man garama. So at most, it's going to be eino mitzvah v'yaisa. But the man that has to wear tefillin, don't tell me what to do, and the like. Now, do you want to say? Okay, so now listen to this. Is there a concept of eino mitzvah v'yaisa in a negative term? And let me give you an example, and you see how absurd this is. The Torah says a Kohen is not allowed to marry a divorced woman. A Yisrael is allowed to. So let's assume that someone's in the shidduch market, and a beautiful, perfect shidduch happens to be with a divorced woman. Okay, so what if he says the following? I know I'm allowed to marry a divorced woman because I'm a Yisrael, but I want to be machmir and keep the negative commandment of not marrying a divorced woman, because even though it doesn't apply to me, but an Eino Mitzvah V'Yaisa still gets reward for keeping a mitzvah. I mean, think about that. The same way a woman would say, I don't have to take lulav, but I'm going to take lulav because I get reward. So why can't the Yisrael say, I'm not going to marry that divorced woman because I want to be makayim, the lo sasa of not marrying a grusha, as an Eino Mitzvah V'Yaisa. That would be a certifiably crazy statement to make. But what? In other words, it's obvious, is it not, that the notion of doing a mitzvah you're not obligated to do is a good thing is talking about positive commandments. Negative commandments only apply to the people they're addressed to. And again, once again, it's the same reason. Because when I do positive commandments, I add to my kedusha. A negative commandment depletes me, but only if I'm rebelling against God. So if a Kohen marries a grusha, he's depleting his holiness. If a Yisrael marries a grusha, he's not depleting his holiness. There is nothing that the negative commandment accomplishes spiritually that makes any sense to observe. Right? So we see this common idea in Maharal, in Meshech Chochma, in the Maharal, and in the Din of Eino Mitzvah V'Yaisa, the chiluk between negatives and positives. Now, let me mention another thing. You had mentioned that it is customary that in addition to the tachrichim, the burial shrouds, a Jewish man is buried in a talus. Right? This is what is always done. If he has his own talus, particularly if he used the talus, he davened in it, we actually, bury him in his talus. If not, the Chevra Kadisha will supply a talus. Now, there is an old custom that the talus is rendered pasul. The talus is made not kosher. A corner, right? A talus is a four-cornered garment. One of the corners is cut off so it's not squared. Pasul, to indicate that he's exempt from mitzvos, he doesn't have to keep these mitzvos anymore. Now, the question is this. I understand that putting Shatnez on a mess would not be a problem because it's only a negative commandment. But here the logic is, Loeg Larash. If I don't wear my tzitzis in front of the dead body because I'm mocking him that he no longer can do the mitzvah, I'm certainly mocking him by putting on a pasul talus, by saying, hey, it doesn't make a difference for you anymore. And here you can't give the answer to distinguish between negative and positive, because wearing tzitzit is a positive commandment that adds to your holiness, and the Metz is not doing it. So the question is, what is the justification of making the talus pasul? Why isn't that Loeg Larash? Now, because of this, there were a number of Gedolim who disagreed with this minhag, and they left an instruction that they wanted to be buried in a kosher talus. And I'll tell you two stories about this because they both occurred around the same time. One story involved the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon himself left instructions that he was to be buried in a kosher talus because he felt it was Loeg Larash. Now, the Vilna Gaon, as I mentioned, died Chol HaMoed Sukkos, and for the last months of his life, there was I think his wife was already nifteris, his wife predeceased him, so he was alone, but there were Talmidim that would take care of him, and one of his closest Talmidim was a person called Rav Sadia. And Rav Sadia was with the Gaon for 24 hours a day, but after Yom Kippur, the Vilna Gaon seemed to be in relatively good health, and there were other people around. He had children around. So Rav Sadia wanted to visit his parents, who lived near Vilna, for Sukkot. He just went to his parents for Sukkot. And then he gets word that the Vilna Gaon got very ill and died Chol HaMoed Sukkos. So he rushed back to go to the Levaya, and not just because it's Levaya of his Rebbe, but because the Vilna Gaon had confided in him that he wanted to be buried in a kosher talus, and the Chevra Kadisha wasn't aware of that yet. So he runs back, but he comes up in the middle of the funeral. And the Vilna Gaon's body, they didn't use coffins then, just like Yerushalayim. The Vilna Gaon was already draped in a puzzle talus. So he said, stop. The funeral was stopped. He says, the Gra commanded that he wear a kosher talus. So a Beis Din was convened. They had to decide what to do. Should they honor the Gra's request? So the Vilna Gaon's funeral was stopped right in the middle. The Beis Din convened, and they paskined that if HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed us to put a puzzle talus on him, and we didn't get word until we went this far, it is the will of Hashem that we don't depart from the minhag. And as a result, the Vilna Gaon was buried in a puzzle talus. It's interesting. There are other times, I think I mentioned it, there are times where the Vilna Gaon wanted to depart from a standard minhag, and also heavenly events prevented him. The Vilna Gaon held that one should recite Birkas Kohanim every day, even in Chutz La'aretz. And every time he tried to do that in his minyan, there was a fire in the show, and they had to close down for a few weeks or whatever it was. Min HaShamayim, they were ma'akiv. Now, the second story was almost the same time, and this involved a great, great tzaddik in Lithuania, Rabbi Alexander Ziskind from Horadna, who wrote a tremendously beautiful Musar Sefer of Avodas Hashem called Yesod V'Shoresh HaAvoda. I don't think it's ever been translated in English. It's really one of the great Musar Sfarim, although there's a lot of Kabbalah in it. Maybe that's why they didn't translate it. Tremendous tzaddik, who lived around the same time as the Vilna Gaon. Their lives overlapped, although he survived the Vilna Gaon. He also left an instruction that he was to be buried in a kosher talus. And they did. They actually put a kosher talus on him. But as they were lowering the body, the talus caught on a nail. And it ripped. So once again, that was seen as a sign min hashamayim that you don't change the minhag.
I was on 8.
You don't want to give it too much Meis?
Yeah.
I'll check that. You are correct that when a garment is ripped, it's not makabel tuma. But the truth of the matter is, the tachrichim for sure are tumah, right? But you're saying because the talus is holy, we don't want to have too much mess. I'll check it. But being as it may, the Vilna Gaon held that that's not enough to override the Loeg Larash. Yeah, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
If you cut the corner off,
Yeah.
the beged isn't required in tzitzit.
No, that's correct. You're 100% correct.
So our minhag was to cut off one of the tzitzit.
Yeah, there are two. It's a very good point. There are two different variations. There are two different variations of what the minhag is. One is to cut off the tzitzis, in which case he is wearing a 4-cornered garment without tzitzis. Others say cut off the corner. In fact, let me explain the background a little bit. That may address the Loeg Larash problem, meaning to put a 4-cornered garment that's missing the tzitzis is making fun of him by saying, you don't have this mitzvah. So that's why the Vilna Gaon said, put on a kosher talus. So some want to address the Vilna Gaon's concern and preserve the minhag by burying him in a talus in which you round off or cut off one of the corners. That way, you're kind of killing two birds with one stone. You're keeping the minhag of making it a puzzle, but you're not making fun of him because you're not putting on a beged that's chayav in tzitzis. So that would be a compromise for that position. I should have clarified that.
How is it that they wouldn't know? It doesn't make sense.
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, if the Vilna Gaon had this wish, one would have figured it would have been communicated to more than one person who happens to be out of town at the time. It's a good question. I don't know. There's a bit of a mystery in some of these stories. If the Vilna Gaon cared enough, he should have made it known to them. For sure. Now, they may not have, the mashma says they would have listened to him. Had they known ahead of time, they actually would have listened to him, but they didn't know. By the way, one other thing about the Yesod V'Shoresh HaAvoda, in the time of the Vilna Gaon, there was the famous story of the Ger Tzedek of Vilna. Have you heard about this? This was Valentin Potocki. Count Potocki was the richest landowner in Poland. He had 999 estates.
Wow.
And somebody asked him, why don't you just get another one, make it 1,000? He said, no. If people say I have 1,000 estates, they'll say, it's an approximation. Maybe he has 990. But if it's 999, they know this is exactly what I have. They're not going to round it off or whatever it is. So he was a very, very wealthy man. And his son Valentin, from the time he was young, somehow wanted to be connected to Judaism, even though his family were the typical, anti-Semitic Catholics. I mean, they were not friendly to Jews at all. And he talked about it at the age of 7. On Shabbos, he had this tremendous turbulence in his soul. He could find no rest, agitated every Shabbos because he wasn't connecting to Shabbos. So eventually he became a ger, but he lived in secrecy because in those days, in Poland, Vilna was part of Poland then, it goes back and forth, you could be burnt at the stake for converting to Judaism.
Wow.
So he literally lived a secret life as a poor person who studied with the Vilna Gaon. But his whereabouts were revealed by another Jew. A Jew kind of turned him in. Also, the Vilna Gaon cursed that family that they continued to suffer for hundreds of years afterwards. And because Count Potocki had so much influence, he managed to make a deal that as long as his son would just keep Judaism in private, he could live. Just come home, openly identify yourself as Catholic, and you can do what you want privately. And this is special connections. And Valentin, or he's called Avram ben Avram, refused. He said he was not going to represent himself, and he says he will die. He will die al Kiddush Hashem. The night before his execution, he's going to be burned. He was going to be burnt. The night before his death, the Vilna Gaon said to him, through Kabbalah and through miracles, I could release you. I could get you out of here. So Avram ben Avram asked the Vilna Gaon, am I halachically obligated to be saved by supernatural, miraculous means? Mm-hmm. Does pikuach nefesh require that you use miracles? So the Vilna Gaon said no, because the Torah only requires natural processes. You're not obligated. I can save you, but you're not obligated. So he said, if I'm not obligated, I would rather die al Kiddush Hashem. And he was burnt at the stake.
By
the
whom?
Second by the government, by the government in Vilna. He was burnt at the stake the second day of Shavuos. And his ashes are buried next to the Vilna Gaon. I mean, the Vilna Gaon died afterwards, but they were right next to each other. And until the Holocaust, in the great Shul of Vilna, when they did Yiskor, they said a special Yiskor. They didn't say for the Vilna Gaon, a special Yiskor for Avram ben Avram, the Ger Tzedek of Vilna. In the Volozhiner Yeshiva, which was founded by the disciple of the Vilna Gaon, Rav Chaim of Volozhin, they had a certain nigun for Ashreinu Matov Chalkeinu. We're so happy, how good is our lot, that was said to be the nigun that the Ger Tzedek of Vilna sang as he was being led to his execution. That became part of the lore in the Volozhiner Yeshiva. I think I don't know the nigun myself, but I think on YouTube you can actually find it, that nigun being preserved. Now, the one thing...
Would that be considered suicide?
No, that's the point. You are only obligated, that's the point. You are obligated to sustain your life by natural means. You are not obligated to sustain your life by miraculous means. The Vilna Gaon said, I could save you by a miracle. A miracle.
Not changing.
No, you're correct. If he could save his life in a normal way, he would be obligated and it would be suicide. The chiddush is, it was a miracle, so you don't have to do that. So the one thing that the government didn't want is the government didn't want him to become a martyr. They didn't want a lot of Jews gathering.
Right.
So they prohibited on pain of death anybody to be present. It was going to be a private thing. Nobody was allowed to be there. But it is said that Rabbi Alexander Ziskin of Haradna, the Yesod B'Shorosh Havayda, managed to sneak in, and he snuck under the fence, and he was right next to the Ger Tzedek as he was being burnt, and he heard the Ger Tzedek saying the bracha. There's a bracha when you die al Kiddush Hashem. There's a bracha that you recite because it's a mitzvah. Sher Kiddishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu l'kadesh shemo b'rabim. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman taught that to the Kovna Ghetto before they were massacred. And Rabbi Alexander Ziskin said he was zocheh to answer amen to the bracha of the Ger Tzedek right before he died on the second day of Shavuos. Over his kever, there was a beautiful, beautiful oak tree that somehow sprouted up. And that tree was there for more than 100 years. The tree died in the Holocaust. The tree itself died with the destruction of Vilna as a city. The tree no longer died, no longer was there. So whatever it is, it's very interesting stories and the like. This is Avram ben Avram Hager. And I don't know, why did I mention that? Because I mentioned, the two people who wanted the talis to be kosher were the Gra and the Yesod B'Shorosh Avoda, and both of them had an interesting connection with Avram ben Avram the Ger. The Gra was his Rabbi, and the Yesod B'Shorosh Avoda was Zocha, he says, to be there, to hear the bracha that was recited, Al Kiddush Hashem. So ultimately we are left with the question. I mean, just to remind that the question basically is that putting the talis on the mess and then making the talis puzzle is making fun of the person, but that's what I suggested. There may be a difference between cutting off a tzitzis and cutting off a corner. You see the difference. When I cut off the tzitzis, he is actually in a state of transgression. He's wearing a four-cornered garment without tzitzis, and that's Loeg Larash because you don't have that mitzvah anymore. Masha'en Kain, if the corner is rounded, it's like anything else. It's a garment that's not four corners. So I'm not making fun of him because he's just not wearing, it's equivalent to not wearing a talis at all in that way. So that would be the source of the compromise position. Okay, so Baruch Hashem, I think we finished more or less our discussion of Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim. Next week, we're going to discuss Tefillin, because Tefillin, too, is actually in commemoration of Yitzias Mitzrayim. And we'll talk about some aspects of how Tefillin commemorates the Exodus.
So, Meis is a dead person, correct?
That's correct.
And how could you embarrass a dead person?
No, so the idea here is the dead body does not get embarrassed, but there is a neshama, there's a soul, and the soul is aware of what you're doing in front of the body. So when I do certain things in front of a dead body, I am humiliating that soul. That soul feels pain. That is a real live entity. In fact, the body, the truth is, if you understand death a certain way, death is described as taking off a bathrobe. I mean, a person is going to a swimming pool or going to a bath. So I take off my robe. The body is the robe of the person. The person is the soul. So death is nothing more than taking off the garment. The soul does not die. The soul is very much alive. Okay, you all have a good week.
What's the minute of putting this garment that appears to look like a talit? What is that? What is?
Yeah. So what's the basis of a talit at all? Like why?
It's not a talit. We all agree it's not a talit.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. Oh, in other words, you're saying once you make it possible, once it's not a talis anymore, what's the purpose of it?
Yes.
Yeah. So
you don't need to answer right now. I'm just
okay. All right. Well, I'll think about it maybe next week.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much. Okay. You all have a. Okay. I don't want to keep. Okay. You all have a good week and take care.